Recognize the senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. And first of all, let me thank my colleague from South Carolina, Senator Graham, for his very kind words. I return the same kind of compliments to him for his great work in helping to build this bill and get us moved to this point. I'm going to make just a few remarks right now in response to some of the allegations and mischaracterizations that my colleagues on the other side have made about how this bill has been structured in terms of its evaluation and scoring. And then later, I'm going to come and give a much longer speech, sorry, sir, on the bill itself. But the things that were said this morning just have to be responded to. First of all, it is said that the reason that we are going to increase the debt ceiling in the bill is because we are spending so much money and driving the deficit up. Well, first of all, our bill drives the deficit down, not up. And secondly, the reason we are dealing with the debt ceiling in the bill is because under the previous administration's operations, the debt ceiling has already been breached. It was breached on January 2nd. And we are limping along with extraordinary measures, is what we call them here in Washington, to try to keep the government funded until Congress can extend the debt ceiling. This has nothing to do with President Trump. It happened before he even was sworn into office. It has nothing to do with this bill. It has to do with the profligate spending that drove us into a breach of the debt ceiling on January 2. Secondly, my colleagues on the other side try to characterize our choice of the current policy baseline as a gimmick and said it's never been done before. Well, they should have been more careful in their words, because the current policy baseline is currently utilized in the current CBO baseline for many spending programs. In fact, many spending programs, about $2.5 trillion of spending programs, are measured under the current treatment, which the Democrats have been using for decades, to make it so they don't have to count spending increases as an increase in the deficit. They are correct that that policy has never been applied to taxes before, because it was not intended to apply to taxes. That ruling and that system that was set up was intentionally designed to favor tax increases over spending cuts and to force Congress to increase taxes and increase spending. It was a strategy to achieve what we all know of as tax and spend. And no matter how they try to cover it over today in their debate, it comes down to this. They are furious that we refuse to raise taxes in America by $4.3 trillion on Americans. And they claim that our refusal to raise your taxes, America, is going to run up the deficit because they can't get $4 trillion more of your tax revenue into their pockets. Well, the first failure of that rationale is, if you believe that you give them $4.5 trillion by letting them raise your taxes again, if you believe they're going to use that to pay the debt down, let me tell you, there's not a tax increase that I've seen in this Congress in my lifetime that was used to pay the debt down. It was used to increase spending. It's called tax and spend. And it's that bias in our scoring system that we are fixing today. We are fixing it so that current policy is how you treat taxes, just like you treat $2.5 trillion of spending this year in your scoring system. We're evening the balance board between taxing and spending. And America should sigh a sigh of relief that finally we are fixing our scoring procedures so that we don't have a built-in drive to increase taxes. Let's put it another way. One of my colleagues said, just even children can understand the difference between $1 trillion and $0. I think they can also understand that if you don't raise taxes, you're not changing the tax code. You're making it bring in the same revenue that it brought in before. You're not increasing the deficit. you're protecting their wallets. And the bottom line here is very simple. I think every American, at least 90% of them, intuitively understand that the refusal to let your taxes go up by $4 trillion is not a deficit increase. You are not the responsible. Us keeping your money in your pocket is not making you responsible for increasing the deficit. Deficit increases come when Congress keeps spending your money and never, ever controlling its spending. The problem is not a lack of revenue. It is too much spending. So let's make it clear. This is not a gimmick. The gimmick is the one that's been used for all these years. We are making a balance between the treatment of tax and spend so that those taxpayers in America have at least a fair chance against the rules of this chamber. Now, one other thing that I think needs to be made here is there was a lot of talk on the other side, and then I'll stop and bring my longer speech later. One other point that needs to be made here is that it was suggested that this has never been done before, even on taxes. Well, there's a president named President Obama who faced a similar situation like we face today. Only then, he was president when a huge tax cut that President Bush had accomplished was expiring. And all of those tax cuts that President Bush had been able to achieve were going to go away, and everybody's taxes were going to go up. And President Obama said, no, I'm not going to let that happen. So he put a bill out on the floor to stop those tax increases from happening. And he was attacked, actually, for increasing the deficit by not letting taxes go up. And President Obama, through his OMB deputy director, said that keeping tax policy current should be scored under a current policy, and that if his act in letting those tax increases be kept in place should be scored as current policy, not as a tax increase. So you've got one of your own presidents from the Democratic Party saying that letting existing tax law stay in place and protecting against huge tax increases on the American people is the appropriate approach to take. That current policy, and those are their words, current policy is the way we should treat tax policy. So I say to everybody in America who's been hearing all of the politics of fear about what we're doing here and running up the deficit, need to remember that only in Washington, D.C. is the refusal to raise your taxes an increase in the deficit. And we're not going to let that happen. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.